You know what's funny? Patel said, watching his kids play tag between the parked cars. That night, we thought we were just doing our jobs. We had no idea we were starting something bigger. Officer Chen walked by, heading to her patrol car. Hey heroes, she called out with a grin. Some of us are getting together at O'Malley's later. First round's on me. The invitation meant more than just drinks, it was another sign of healing, of bridges being rebuilt. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the station's parking lot, Lee and Patel prepared to head home. Their shift would start again tomorrow, just like always. They'd patrol the same streets, handle the same calls, face the same challenges. But something was different now, not just in them, but in the whole department. You know what my daughter asked me this morning? Lee said, unlocking his car. She wanted to know if superheroes wear police uniforms. He smiled, remembering her serious little face. I told her no, that real heroes just look like regular people doing the right thing when it's hard. Patel laughed, the sound carrying across the parking lot. Deep thoughts for breakfast, huh? Yeah, Lee agreed. But maybe she's onto something. Maybe that's what this whole thing was about, just regular people trying to do the right thing. As they drove away, the station's lights glowed against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new moments of truth. But they'd face them the same way they'd faced that rainy night 6 months ago, with integrity, courage, and the simple belief that doing the right thing matters. The department wasn't perfect, no place is, but it was better. And maybe that's all anyone can ask for, not perfection, but progress. Not instant change, but steady improvement. Not dramatic gestures, but daily choices to do what's right. After all, real change doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it starts with one traffic stop, one decision, one moment when two officers choose to do what's right instead of what's easy. The police station's main conference room was packed, with officers lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. 6 months had passed since that rainy night, and today marked something none of them had expected. Chief Reynolds stood at the podium, his formal uniform pressed and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Real change, he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room, doesn't usually announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it starts with one traffic stop, one decision, one moment when officers choose to do what's right instead of what's easy. Lee and Patel sat in the front row, their families beside them. Lee's daughter quietly colored in her notebook, too young to fully understand why her father was being honored today. Patel's wife held his hand tightly, remembering the sleepless nights and worried conversations of the past months. The actions of officers Lee and Patel that night have led to the most comprehensive reform of our department's accountability standards in 20 years, Reynolds continued. Their dedication to upholding the law equally for everyone has become a model for departments across the state. In the back of the room, Officer Wilson, who'd been one of their harshest critics, stood quietly, his face thoughtful. Next to him, Chen smiled proudly. The old divisions hadn't completely healed, but something had shifted in the department's culture over the past months. But changes like this come with a price, the chief acknowledged. These officers faced criticism, isolation, and threats to their careers. Their families endured whispers and cold shoulders, yet they stood firm, reminding us all what this badge truly represents. Lieutenant Baker, recently promoted to Captain of Internal Affairs, sat on the stage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She'd gotten the position after Walsh's resignation and subsequent guilty plea. The department's old guard had fought the appointment, but times were changing. Today, Reynolds said, picking up 2 commendation medals, we recognized not just 2 officers, but a principle that the law must apply equally to everyone, regardless of rank or position. That integrity isn't just a word we use in ceremonies, but a choice we make every day. As Lee and Patel stood to receive their commendations, memories of the past 6 months flashed through their minds. The late-night calls of support from officers in other precincts. The community members who'd brought coffee and cookies to their families. The young rookies who'd started coming to them for advice about handling difficult situations. But perhaps more important than these medals, Reynolds continued, is the change we've seen in our department. Complaints against officers are down 30%. Voluntary reporting of misconduct has increased. Officers are holding themselves and each other to a higher standard. In the audience, Sergeant Thompson wiped something from his eye that he'd insist later was just dust. He'd stuck by them through everything, becoming not just a supervisor but a friend. His support had inspired others to speak up, to stand for what was right. After the ceremony, as people mingled with coffee and cake, a young officer approached Lee and Patel. "I graduate from the academy next week," she said, her voice nervous but determined. "I just wanted you to know, they teach about your traffic stop now. About how doing the right thing isn't always popular, but it's always right." Outside, the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. News crews packed up their cameras. The story wasn't as exciting as it had been 6 months ago, but its impact continued to ripple through the department and the city. "Remember that night?" Patel asked as they stood in the parking lot, their families chatting nearby. "When we pulled her over?" Lee nodded, fingering the new medal on his chest. "Feels like a lifetime ago." "What about internal affairs?" Patel asked. "The investigation into us." "That's why I called you here," Baker said. "They're wrapping it up. Every camera angle, every witness statement, every procedure you followed that night, it all checks out. You did everything right." The relief should have felt better than it did, but they all knew this was just one battle in a longer war. "Here's the real question," Baker continued, her voice softening. "Are you ready for what comes next? Because clearing your names is one thing, living with the aftermath is another." Through the office window, they could see the daily life of the station continuing. Officers heading out on patrol, detectives working cases, the whole machinery of law enforcement grinding on. They were still part of it all, but something had changed. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You know what my grandfather used to say?" Thompson spoke up, breaking the heavy silence. He was a cop too, back in the 60s. He said, "The badge shines brightest when it costs you something to keep it clean." Lee looked at Patel, seeing in his partner's eyes the same mix of exhaustion and determination he felt. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Baker smiled, a real smile this time. "You do what you've been doing. You show up. You do the job. You remind everyone what this badge is supposed to mean." She stood up. "And you remember that not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they just wear uniforms and do the right thing when it would be easier not to." As they left the office, the afternoon sun streamed through the station windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The TV in the corner was still playing the news, but somehow it seemed less important now. They had done what was right, and whatever came next, they would face it together, not just as partners, but as officers who had chosen to stand by their oath, no matter the cost. 3 weeks had passed since that rainy night, but it felt like 3 years. Lee sat at his temporary desk in the records department, sorting through old case files, the kind of work they gave officers on administrative duty. The small TV mounted in the corner quietly played the local news, where Captain Walsh's case was still making headlines. His phone lit up with a text from Patel. "Break room. Channel 5, you need to see this." Stretching his stiff shoulders, Lee made his way through the maze of filing cabinets. The break room was packed with officers, all eyes fixed on the TV where Captain Walsh's lawyer was giving a press conference on the courthouse steps. "My client has served this department faithfully for over 2 decades, the lawyer was saying, his voice smooth as silk. "These accusations are nothing more than a calculated attempt by certain elements within the department to discredit her reforms in internal affairs." Officer Chen snorted from her spot by the coffee maker. "Reforms? Is that what we're calling it now?" A few others nodded in agreement, but some shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Lee. The department had split into unofficial camps over the past weeks. Some officers went out of their way to show support, leaving coffee on Lee and Patel's desks or backing up their version of events in official statements. Others treated them like they had some contagious disease, switching locker rooms when they walked in or going quiet when they passed by. The latest development, the TV anchor was saying, involves newly released dashboard camera footage that appears to show Captain Walsh's vehicle running a red light. Sources within the department said the footage strongly supports the arresting officer's account of events. Lee felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Patel, who'd just walked in. They hadn't worked a shift together since that night, both reassigned to different administrative duties during the investigation. Patel looked as tired as Lee felt. "They're running the dash cam footage every hour," Patel said quietly. My kid saw it at school on someone's phone. Asked me if that was why some of his friends' parents won't let them come over anymore. The ache in Patel's voice hit Lee hard. They'd both paid prices they never expected. Lee's wife had gotten cold shoulders at the grocery store from other police spouses, and Patel's mother had stopped talking to her bridge club because of the whispers. Officer Lee. A young rookie stood in the doorway, looking nervous. Lieutenant Baker wants to see you both. She says it's important. The walk to Baker's office felt like walking through an invisible minefield. Some officers nodded in support, others turned away, and a few watched with undisguised hostility. The thin blue line, they were learning, could be awfully quick to divide. Baker's office was small but neat, with commendations on the walls and a familiar face sitting across from her desk, Sergeant Thompson, who'd backed them up that first night. He looked worried. "Close the door," Baker said as they entered. "We've got a situation developing. The union president just called. They're getting pressure to distance themselves from your case." "Distance themselves?" Patel repeated. "They're supposed to be defending us." Thompson leaned forward. "Politics. Some of the old guard are saying you broke the unofficial code. Others are worried about what this means for the whole department. If the head of internal affairs can get arrested, then maybe nobody's above the law," Lee finished. "Isn't that the point?" Baker stood up, pacing behind her desk. "There's more. We're hearing rumors about anonymous complaints being filed against both of you. Old cases being scrutinized. Partners you worked with years ago suddenly remembering concerns they had." The weight of it all pressed down on Lee's shoulders. He thought about his kids, about his mortgage, about the career he built over 15 years. One traffic stop, one right decision, and it was all hanging by a thread. "But," Baker continued, a small smile playing at her lips, "you've got support too. More than you know. Officers from other precincts are speaking up. The public's largely on your side. Turns out people like cops who follow the rules, even when it's hard." Thompson pulled out his phone, showing them a news article. County prosecutors just announced they're moving forward with the DUI charges. They say the evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous. "But sir," Patel started to protest. "It's not punishment," Reynolds cut him off. "It's protection, both for you and for the department. We need to show we're taking this seriously." He paused, looking at each officer in turn. "The next few weeks aren't going to be easy. Some people will call you heroes. Others will say you betrayed the badge. The truth is probably somewhere in between." One of the suited men stepped forward. "We'll need you both to give formal statements. Everything you remember, every detail." Captain Walsh's blood alcohol level came back well over the legal limit, but her lawyer's already trying to challenge the test's validity. The chief stood up, walking to his window. Below, more reporters had gathered. "You know what the hardest part of wearing this badge is? It's not the long hours, or the danger, or even the politics. It's doing the right thing when the right thing costs you something." He turned back to face them. "Go home. Get some rest. The storm's coming, and you'll need your strength." His face softened slightly. "And officers, whatever happens next, remember this. You upheld your oath. Not everyone can say that." As they left the chief's office, the morning shift was in full swing. Phones rang, radios crackled, and life went on. But everything felt different now, like the world had shifted slightly on its axis. In the parking lot, they paused by their cars. The news crews were already setting up for their morning broadcasts, their cameras like hungry eyes watching the station doors. "See you tomorrow?" Lee asked, the question carrying more weight than usual. Patel nodded, managing a tired smile. "Yeah, someone's got to keep you out of trouble." He looked at the gathering media circus. "Think we made a difference?" "Ask me in a month," Lee replied, unlocking his car. "Right now, I just want to go home and hug my kids." As they drove away in opposite directions, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the city they'd sworn to protect and serve, no matter the cost. Dawn was breaking over the city as Lee pushed open the heavy glass doors of the station, stepping out into the crisp morning air. He hadn't slept in 24 hours, and his uniform felt like it was made of lead. Patel followed close behind, both officers squinting against the early morning sun. "Look at that," Patel said quietly, nodding toward the parking lot. 3 news vans were already setting up, reporters checking their microphones and camera crews adjusting their equipment. Word had gotten out faster than either of them had expected. Lee's phone buzzed again, the 20th time in the last hour. This time it was his wife. Just saw the news. Are you okay? Please call me. He typed a quick reply, promising to explain everything when he got home. How do you explain a night that changes everything? The station's break room was unusually crowded for this hour. Officers from the incoming shift huddled around the coffee maker, their conversations dropping to whispers as Lee and Patel walked in. A few nodded in greeting, others suddenly became very interested in their phones or coffee cups. Well, if it isn't our department's newest celebrities, Officer Wilson called out from his corner table. His tone walked the line between joking and hostile. Must feel pretty good, taking down the big bad captain, huh? Lee ignored him, pouring coffee into a paper cup with hands that were steadier than he felt. Patel grabbed 2 stale donuts from an open box, offering one to his partner. It was their usual end-of-shift routine, but nothing about this shift had been usual. You know what I heard? Wilson continued, his voice getting louder. I heard she was only 2 blocks from home. Could have just followed her there, made sure she got in safe. But no, you had to play stupid cops. That's enough, Wilson, came a sharp voice from the doorway. Lieutenant Baker stood there, her arms crossed. She was from another precinct, known for her no-nonsense attitude. Don't you have reports to file? As Wilson slunk out, Baker turned to Lee and Patel. The chief wants to see you both. Now, she paused, then added more softly, for what it's worth, half the department's talking about what you did. Not all of it's bad. The walk to the chief's office felt like walking to their own execution. Officers they'd known for years either nodded in respect or looked away. There was no middle ground anymore. They were either heroes or traitors, depending on who you asked. Inside the chief's office, the morning sun streamed through vertical blinds, creating stripes of light across the one carpet. Chief Reynolds sat behind his desk, looking like he hadn't slept either. 2 men in suits, probably from Internal Affairs, stood near the window, their expressions unreadable. Sit down, officers, Reynolds said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. His voice gave away nothing. I'd reviewed your body camera footage, all of it. The traffic stop, the field sobriety test refusal, the processing. Everything. Lee and Patel sat straight in their chairs, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Through the window, they could hear the distant sound of more news vans arriving. Captain Walsh's lawyer is already claiming harassment, one of the suited men said. Says you targeted her specifically, that this was some kind of revenge for past internal affairs investigations. That's not true, sir, Patel started, but the chief held up his hand. We know. The dash cam footage shows her running the red light. The body cams show everything else. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. But this isn't going to be about truth. This is going to be about perception, politics, and damage control. Sir, Lee said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion, we did everything by the book. Exactly the way we were trained. Yes, you did, Reynolds agreed, surprising them both. That's what makes this so complicated. You did everything right, which means we can't sweep this under the rug even if we wanted to. Too many people already know. The sun climbed higher outside, the city fully awake now. Someone had turned on the TV in the outer office, and they could hear a news anchor talking about breaking developments in a police scandal. Here's what's going to happen, Reynolds continued. Internal Affairs, the ones not connected to Captain Walsh, will conduct a full investigation. You'll both be placed on administrative duty during the investigation. The door opened and Sergeant Thompson walked in, his face grim. He'd aged 10 years since they'd called him an hour ago. Captain Walsh, he said, nodding professionally. Your lawyer's waiting. Officers, a word. In the hallway, Thompson looked at his 2 officers, his expression unreadable. The chief's been notified. This is going to be a circus, and you 2 are going to be right in the center ring. He paused, running a hand over his tired face. Are you absolutely certain about everything? Every detail? Because once this train starts rolling, there's no stopping it. Lee and Patel shared a look, partners who'd been through enough together to read each other's thoughts. We're sure, Sergeant Lee said. Everything's on camera. Everything's by the book. The brass is already circling the wagons, Thompson warned. This could get ugly, real ugly. Patel straightened his uniform. Then it gets ugly. But we swore an oath to uphold the law. All of it, for everyone. Back in the processing room, they could hear Walsh's lawyer's voice, sharp and professional, already building their defense. The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring its own battles. But for now, they had this moment, this choice to stand by what they believed was right. One more thing, Thompson said, his voice softening slightly. Whatever happens next, I want you both to know you did good. Not easy, but good. He turned to head back to his office, then stopped. And maybe this department needed something like this. A reminder of what we're supposed to stand for. The fluorescent lights continued their endless buzz overhead as Lee and Patel returned to finish processing one of the most important arrests of their careers. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the real storm, they knew, was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of the police station's processing area buzzed overhead as Officers Lee and Patel led Captain Walsh through the familiar hallway. The night shift desk sergeant looked up from his computer, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his mouth as he recognized who was in custody. "This is your last chance," Walsh said, her voice low enough that only Lee and Patel could hear. Her designer heels clicked against the linoleum floor, each step echoing in the quiet station. "Think about your families. Think about your careers. One phone call from me, and you'll both be directing traffic in the rain for the next decade." Patel kept his face neutral, though his heart was racing. The walk to the processing area had never felt longer. Other officers they passed quickly found reasons to look away or duck into nearby rooms. Nobody wanted to be a witness to this moment. "Captain," Lee said quietly, "please don't make this harder than it needs to be." His voice was steady, but inside, he felt like he was walking on thin ice. One wrong step, one mistake in procedure, and everything could fall apart. The processing room was empty except for Officer Chen at the desk, a veteran who'd seen everything in her 20 years on the force. Or at least, she thought she had until tonight. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized Walsh, but her professional demeanor never wavered. "I need to use the restroom," Walsh announced, straightening her shoulders despite the handcuffs. "And I want my phone call. My lawyer's already on the way, but I have other calls to make." Lee nodded to Chen, who stood up to escort Walsh to the restroom. As they waited, Patel began filling out the preliminary paperwork, his pen scratching against the form with perhaps more force than necessary. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. "You know what's funny?" Walsh said when she returned, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that made both officers tense up. "I was planning to reorganize internal affairs next month. Clean house, bring in some fresh blood." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I was actually considering both of you for promotion. Ironic, isn't it?" Lee continued with the booking process, carefully avoiding her gaze. "Please state your full name and date of birth for the record." "Oh, now you want to play it by the book?" Walsh's calm facade cracked slightly. "Let me tell you what's really going to happen. By tomorrow morning, every officer in this department will know about this. Some will call you heroes, most won't. They'll see you as traitors who turned on one of their own." The camera in the corner of the room blinked steadily, recording everything. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of the station, phones ringing, distant voices, the squeak of boots on the floor. But in here, the air felt thick with tension. "You'll be the ones other officers warned their partners about," Walsh continued, her words precise and cutting. "The ones nobody wants to work with because they can't trust you to have their backs. Is that what you want? To be outcasts in your own department?" Patel looked up from the paperwork. "Captain, would you please remove any jewelry and empty your pockets?" His voice was professional, but there was steel beneath the politeness. Walsh laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just about tonight. This is about how things work in the real world. The world where good cops sometimes look the other way to help other good cops." "No," Captain Lee said, finally meeting her eyes. "This is about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He gestured to the processing desk. "Please place your items in the tray." As Walsh slowly removed her jewelry, expensive pieces that clinked softly against the plastic tray, her phone buzzed. Chen checked the screen before placing it with the other items. "Your lawyer's in the lobby," she announced. "Good," Walsh said, her composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. Then let's talk about what it would take to make this go away. Everyone makes mistakes, right? Even dedicated officers like yourselves might sometimes misremember details of a traffic stop. Yeah, Lee said quietly. We didn't let him go either. That's the point, isn't it? The law has to mean the same thing for everyone, or it means nothing for anyone. Kim and Rivera headed back to their car, leaving the partners to handle the transport. As they walked back to their patrol car, Lee and Patel could feel the weight of every step. They weren't just walking to their vehicle, they were walking toward a moment that would define their careers, their integrity, maybe even their department's future. Through the window, they could see Walsh had finished her phone call. She sat perfectly still now, staring straight ahead, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. The rain streaked down the window, distorting her image like a watercolor painting. Ready? Lee asked his partner, reaching for the driver's door. Patel nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. Ready. Whatever comes next, at least we can look at ourselves in the mirror tomorrow morning. As they climbed into the patrol car, the radio crackled with routine traffic, other officers going about their nights, handling the usual calls that kept a city running. Somewhere out there, someone else was probably facing their own moment of truth, their own test of character. The engine hummed to life, and Lee carefully pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, he could see the diner's neon signs growing smaller, the scene of their decision fading into the night. But its importance would echo long after the rain stopped and the sun rose on whatever tomorrow would bring. Officer Kim's patrol car fell in behind them, lights still flashing as they began the drive to the station. The streets were almost empty now, the late hour having cleared away all but the most determined travelers. It felt fitting somehow, an empty stage for what might be the most important act of their careers. The backup patrol car's lights painted the wet street in alternating red and blue as Officers Lee and Patel stepped away from their vehicle. Captain Walsh sat in the back seat, her silhouette visible through the window, still maintaining her rigid posture despite the circumstances. They needed a moment to think, to plan their next steps carefully. What a mess, Patel muttered, running his hand through his rain-dampened hair. The two partners moved toward the front of their patrol car, just far enough to talk privately but still keep an eye on their passenger. The backup officers, Kim and Rivera, stood by their own vehicle, giving them space while securing the scene. Lee leaned against the hood of their car, feeling the warmth of the engine through his uniform. Remember that speech they gave us at the academy? About integrity being non-negotiable? He let out a long breath that fogged in the cold night air. They never mentioned how heavy integrity would feel. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, and the diner's crowd had thinned out, though a few dedicated observers remained pressed against the windows. A coffee-clutching waitress had even stepped outside for a better view, sheltering under the building's awning. My dad used to say that doing the right thing is easy. It's dealing with the consequences that's hard, Patel said, checking his phone. Already, messages were starting to pop up from other officers. Word was spreading fast. We need to document everything perfectly. You know they're going to go through this with a microscope. Inside the patrol car, they could see Walsh talking on her phone, the one call they had to allow her. Her voice was muffled but animated, hands moving in sharp gestures despite the handcuffs. They'd been careful to leave her enough dignity to make the call privately, but not so much that she could cause problems. Officer Kim walked over, her boots splashing through puddles. Sergeant Thompson is on his way, she said, her voice low. He wants everything by the book. Full report, blood alcohol test, the works. She paused, glancing at the Range Rover. You sure about this? I mean, it's the head of INA. That's exactly why we have to do this right, Lee replied, straightening up. If we let this slide, what message does that send? That the rules only apply to some people. He checked his body camera again, a nervous habit he developed over years on the force. Patel nodded, adding, if it was anyone else, a teacher, a lawyer, a business owner, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. The badge doesn't put you above the law. It holds you to a higher standard. The night felt heavy with possibility. Every decision they made now would ripple outward, affecting not just their careers but the entire department. They could already imagine the conversations that would happen tomorrow in precinct break rooms, at roll call, in the chief's office. We should call the union rep, Lee said finally, pulling out his phone. Not because we did anything wrong, but because we did everything right, and we'll need someone in our corner when the storm hits." A text message lit up Patal's phone, his wife wondering why he wasn't responding to her earlier messages. He typed a quick, "Working late, tell you everything later," and put the phone away. Some stories were too complicated for text messages. Rivera walked over from the backup car, holding a breathalyzer kit. "She's asking for her lawyer," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "Says she won't take any tests until they arrive." "That's her right," Lee responded, but the refusal gets noted in the report. He looked at his watch. Barely an hour had passed since they first spotted the Range Rover, but it felt like days. "We'll transport her to the station ourselves. Less chance of anyone claiming special treatment." The four officers stood in the rain for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. They'd all joined the force to make a difference, to serve and protect. But nights like this tested what those words really meant. Patal broke the silence first. "Remember that drunk driver we stopped last month? The college kid. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just staring out into the rainy night. He begged us to let him go too. Said it would ruin his future. You know what this could do to my career?" Her voice had changed, some of the edge replaced by something that sounded almost like pleading. 23 years on the force. First woman to head internal affairs in this department. All of that gone because of one stupid mistake. Lee felt the weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders. He thought about his own career, about Patal's, about all the officers who'd looked the other way in similar situations. But he also thought about that delivery truck that had barely avoided being hit, about all the families he had to notify over the years when drunk driving ended in tragedy. "Captain," he said, his voice gentle but unwavering, "please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Walsh stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty. Finding none, she looked up at the night sky, blinking rapidly. Whether it was from the rain or tears, neither officer could tell. "You've really gone and done it now," she whispered, but there was something different in her voice, something that sounded almost like respect mixed with the anger and fear. As Lee began to read her rights, his words clear and measured in the night air, Patal called dispatch to report the situation. Inside the diner, phones were already out, recording the scene through the rain-streaked windows. By morning, this would be all over the department, maybe even the local news. The handcuffs clicked shut, each metal snap echoing with finality. Captain Walsh stood still, her head held high despite everything, a study in pride even in defeat. As they led her to the patrol car, she suddenly stopped. "Officers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought. I never expected." She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished as another patrol car's lights appeared in the distance, responding to Patal's call for backup. The rain began to fall harder now, washing away the last traces of perfume and whiskey from the air. In the growing puddles on the ground, the diner's neon lights danced and fractured, creating patterns that looked almost like tears. The moment Captain Walsh stepped out of her Range Rover, the atmosphere changed. She swayed slightly, catching herself against the car door, but quickly straightened up, pulling her designer jacket tight around her shoulders. The diner's neon lights caught the silver in her hair and the gold of her department pins, creating an almost theatrical scene on the wet pavement. Officer Lee took a small step back, maintaining a professional distance. His partner, Patal, remained alert on the passenger side, his hand resting casually near his body camera. They'd done hundreds of traffic stops before, but this one felt different, like walking through a minefield in dress shoes. "Do you have any idea," Walsh began, her words precise but slightly stretched at the edges, "how this is going to look? 2 beat cops harassing a department captain." She smoothed down her jacket, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with her commanding tone. The scent of expensive perfume couldn't quite mask the unmistakable smell of whiskey that followed her movement. Lee kept his voice steady, professional. "Captain, we observed your vehicle run a red light and nearly cause an accident. We're just following standard procedure." He gestured toward the front of the patrol car, where the dash cam was recording everything. "Would you mind walking this way with me?" Inside the diner, more faces appeared at the windows. The night shift waitress, her coffee pot frozen mid-pour, watched with the kind of fascination reserved for late-night drama. A truck driver at the counter had stopped mid-bite of his burger, sensing the tension even through the glass. Walsh's laugh was sharp, cutting through the night air like a knife. Standard procedure. Let me tell you about standard procedure, officer. She took a step forward, and Lee caught the slight wobble in her designer heels. Standard procedure is knowing when to show proper respect to your superior officers. Standard procedure is understanding department politics. Patel moved closer, his footsteps careful on the wet pavement. Captain, we respect your position, but our job right now is to ensure everyone's safety. His calm voice seemed to float in the space between them, trying to build a bridge over troubled waters. The captain turned to face him, and for a moment, something flickered across her face. Maybe shame, maybe fear, quickly replaced by anger. Officer Patel, isn't it? I remembered your file crossing my desk last month. Something about a civilian complaint. The threat wasn't subtle. Patel felt his stomach tighten. That complaint had been dismissed as unfounded, but just the mention of it showed how quickly this could turn personal. He shared a quick glance with Lee, both officers remembering their academy days, when everything seemed simpler, when right and wrong didn't come with quite so many shades of gray. Captain, Lee stepped in, drawing her attention back to him. We need to conduct a field sobriety test. It's not optional, and we're not trying to disrespect you. We're just doing our jobs. He kept his tone firm but gentle, the way he'd talk to anyone who needed to hear hard truth wrapped in kindness. Walsh's hand went to her phone. One call, she said, her fingers hovering over the screen. One call, and both of you could be walking beats in the worst neighborhoods this city has to offer. Is that what you want? Over a simple traffic stop. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across the scene like a spotlight. In its brief illumination, Lee could see the slight tremble in Walsh's hand, the way her makeup couldn't quite hide the flush in her cheeks. Behind the authority and threats, she looked scared, and scared people, he'd learned long ago, were often the most dangerous. We're recording, Captain, Patel reminded her quietly. Everything. Both cameras. He wasn't threatening, just stating a fact that hung in the air between them like the mist from the earlier rain. The night seemed to hold its breath. In the diner, someone dropped a plate, the crash muffled by the glass windows. A few drops of rain started to fall again, creating tiny dark spots on Walsh's expensive jacket. Officer, she said, her words coming out just a little too carefully, like someone trying very hard to sound sober. I don't believe this stop is necessary. I'm heading home from a department function. Lee could feel Patel tensing up on the other side of the vehicle. This wasn't just any traffic stop anymore. This was the kind of situation that could make or break careers. Theirs, not hers. Ma'am, you ran a red light back there, Lee said, keeping his voice professional and steady. And you nearly hit another vehicle. He noticed her gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white under the flashlight's beam. I said, she repeated, her voice taking on that distinctive tone of authority that high-ranking officers perfect over years of command. This stop is unnecessary. I'm sure we can handle this professionally. She reached for her department ID, the leather wallet flashing gold in the flashlight's beam. Lee felt a bead of sweat roll down his back, despite the cool night air. In his earpiece, he could hear Patel's steady breathing, waiting for his partner's lead. They had a choice to make, right here, right now. It was the kind of choice that every officer dreads, the moment when doing the right thing and doing the easy thing split off in opposite directions. Through the open window, the sound of the diner's door chime tinkled as a customer walked out. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Lee's mind raced through the possibilities. They could apologize, let her go, pretend they didn't smell the alcohol on her breath or notice her slightly slurred speech. It would be easy, probably even expected. But then he thought about that delivery truck she almost hit, about all the times he'd seen the aftermath of drunk driving accidents, about the oath he'd taken when he put on this badge. He clicked his body camera once, making sure it was still recording. Whatever happened next, he wanted it on record. Captain Walsh, he said, his voice firm but respectful, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. The look she gave him could have frozen hell over twice. In that moment, Lee knew their quiet night shift had just turned into something that would be talked about in the department for years to come. Whether that was good or bad remained to be seen, but as he heard Patel move to back him up, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of what would prove to be a very long night. The diner's neon sign continued to flicker overhead, casting alternating shadows across the scene as Captain Walsh's hand tightened on her department ID. The next few minutes would change everything, and everyone involved knew it. The only question was, how? The gentle hum of the patrol car's engine filled the quiet night as Officers Lee and Patel cruised through downtown Seattle's rain-slicked streets. It was just past midnight, and the city had that peculiar calm that comes right after the bar crowd heads home, but before the early morning workers start their day. Lee took a sip from his now cold coffee, grimacing at the taste. "You know what's funny?" he said to his partner. "My wife keeps telling me to get a desk job. Says night shifts are killing me slowly." He chuckled, adjusting the heat in their car as a light drizzle tapped against the windshield. Patel, who'd been his partner for the last 3 years, smiled while keeping his eyes on the road. "My mom says the same thing. Keeps sending me job listings for security management positions." He shook his head, remembering the latest LinkedIn post she'd forwarded him. "But honestly, I'd take this over sitting in meetings all day." The radio crackled with routine updates, a noise complaint in Capitol Hill, a false alarm at a convenience store, the usual midnight symphony of a big city. They'd been partners long enough to develop that comfortable silence that comes with true friendship, broken only by occasional comments about passing scenes or shade jokes about their regular customers. "Hey, speaking of desk jobs," Lee started, but his words cut off as a black SUV blazed through a red light at the intersection ahead, nearly clipping a late-night delivery truck. "Well, would you look at that?" Patel said, already flipping on their lights. The SUV was high-end. A new Range Rover that probably cost more than both officers made in a year combined. It swerved slightly as it continued down the street, suggesting this wasn't just someone in a hurry. Lee grabbed the radio while Patel smoothly pulled their cruiser behind the SUV. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. We're initiating a traffic stop on a black Range Rover license plate." He rattled off the numbers as they flashed in the headlights. There was something about the way the SUV was moving that made both officers sit up a little straighter. The Range Rover didn't pull over immediately, which wasn't unusual for this part of town. Some people liked to find well-lit areas, and others just took their sweet time, hoping the officers would give up. But after about 30 seconds, the vehicle finally pulled to the curb near a 24-hour diner, its wheels slightly scraping against the curb. Following their usual routine, both officers did a quick check of their surroundings. The diner's neon sign cast a blue and pink glow over the wet pavement. A few late-night customers peered through the windows, always eager for some entertainment to go with their midnight pancakes. The street was otherwise empty, just the way they liked it for traffic stops. "Something feels off about this one," Lee said, adjusting his body camera. It had become second nature now, making sure it was recording before approaching any vehicle. Too many officers had learned the hard way that an unrecorded interaction could turn into a career-ending nightmare. Patel nodded, already running the plates through their system. His eyebrows shot up as he read the results. "Lee, this vehicle's registered to the department." That made both officers pause. Department vehicles usually had official plates, but this one was civilian registered, yet somehow tied to their police department. The system didn't show which division or officer it belonged to. Another red flag that made their instincts buzz. "Let's play it by the book," Lee said, his voice taking on that professional edge that Patel knew meant his partner was preparing for anything. Extra careful on this one. They did their usual walk-up routine, but with an added layer of caution. Lee approached the driver's side, while Patel hung back slightly on the passenger side, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The SUV's tinted windows were rolled up, and through the glass they could make out a single occupant in the driver's seat. The window rolled down slowly, and the scent of expensive perfume mixed with something else, something that made Lee's police instincts kick into high gear. He'd done enough DUI stops to recognize the smell of alcohol when it hit him. "Good evening, I'm Officer Lee with the Seattle Police Department. Do you know why we pulled you over tonight?" The woman behind the wheel turned to face him, and Lee felt his stomach drop. He'd never met her in person, but every officer in the department knew that face from the memo that had circulated last month. Captain Dana Walsh, the newly appointed head of internal affairs, was sitting in the driver's seat, her eyes slightly unfocused as she looked up at him.